Now there remains to be seen what ought to be the criteria and actions of a prince dealing with his subjects and friends. And because I know that many have written about this, I am afraid by writing about it again that I shall be thought presumptuous, and all the more so for departing in my discussion of this material from the procedures of others. But my intention being to write something useful for whoever understands it, it seemed more appropriate to pursue the effectual truth of the matter rather than its imagined one. And many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in reality. For there is such a gap between how one lives and how one should live that he who neglects what is being done for what should be done will learn his destruction rather than his preservation. Okay. This is a very, very famous passage, perhaps one of the most famous in The Prince. But we have to be very careful about how we understand the sort of central sentence, because it's very easy for the reader to read this as simply saying there is reality on the one side and imagination on the other. And we have to turn away from what we wish would be the case, what should be the case, what our religious and moral values tell us ought to be the case, and to the reality of things as they are. Okay, but I think the passage is in fact far, far more complicated and raises much more difficult questions than simply turning from the imaginary to the real, as is the traditional reading. When we look at this, the phrase in Italian, which is difficult, the notion here is la verità effettuale della cosa, and what exactly does that mean? Why is that a strange phrase? He doesn't say, it's very important, he doesn't say turn to the truth, period, as if there's some truth. He doesn't even say turn to the truth of the cosa, the thing, however we want to define that, the question at hand. Doesn't even say that. He qualifies the very notion of truth so that it's a verità effettuale, an effectual truth, or as we might say, a truth that lies in its effects. That is a truth that isn't true in and of itself, but only insofar as it produces the effects of truth, that the effects follow from its truth in reality, that they're inscribed in reality. Okay. But that in turn, which is important, moves us away from a kind of disembodied ideal truth to a notion of a truth that must make itself true in material reality. It must inscribe itself in material reality. But the qualification of verità as effettuale means that, it implies, as the sentence does, that truth in general isn't simply a homogeneous thing, a body of propositions or something like that, because it opens the, not simply the possibility, but grammatically, in a sense, the necessity that if there is a verità effettuale, an effectual truth, there must be other kinds of truth. And the implication here by the grammar of the sentence opens this up is that there is both, with the truth is not homogeneous, but contains within itself both effective elements, or elements that produce effects, and elements that are imaginary and produce, let us say, imaginary effects. And so what Machiavelli is asking us to do here is not to turn to the truth as if it's available for us to simply appropriate and use for our purposes, but he's asking us to examine what we call the truth, or not simply what we call, what is the truth, and to discern in it a contradiction between that part of the truth that produces effect, that is capable of inscribing itself in reality and changing things in the way that he thinks is desirable. And that part of the truth that cannot and does not lead to change, and because of that can be called imaginary, which doesn't mean that it's not true, but it remains without effect. So he's, in essence, asking us to draw a line of demarcation within the field that we call the truth or the true, and discern within it contradictory elements. And he's warning us that even in a sense there's a true truth and an untrue truth, which is nevertheless part of the true. And he's moving us away from what we might call a sort of contemplative or speculative notion of the truth to an idea of the truth that whose truth isn't already given, which is probably the imaginary element, but a truth that remains to be inscribed in its effect in reality. And in this sense, the verità effettuale, the effective or effectual truth, is not a truth given all at once, but a truth that has to be produced in reality. That is, it's by its nature incomplete. And to use a term that we see in various parts of the prince in very surprising places, there's a kind of infinite nature to that truth, because the truth must inscribe itself in the reality that comes to it, because reality for Machiavelli is not an inert given that we can simply operate on. It's a constantly changing element that requires adjustment. It requires the operationalization of virtu to bring those effects to reality. And so this is a truth that isn't simply something that one knows. It's not a matter of knowledge only. It's not a matter of belief or conviction. This is a matter of practice. That is, one must intervene in the reality around to produce the effect of truth. So what I think is extraordinarily important here, there are many things to say, but truth is no longer passive. It's no longer a property. It's no longer a question of adequation. It becomes something that must be realized or effectuated, to use that term, in a reality that itself is not inert. It's not simply, as Machiavelli will say in a contradictory way later about fortune, a matter to be shaped. It's not that. It's a matter that in certain ways is always presenting itself to us in different forms, in different levels of difficulty in terms of our ability to shape it. And so in this sense, la verità effettuale is a truth that must constantly adjust itself to the diversity of the reality that it confronts in order to bring about its own being, the being of truth itself. And I think the idea here is that truth cannot be disengaged from the idea of the preservation of, in a sense, the life, not of the prince or even of the people, but of a certain society. And for that society to continue, for it to persist in the face of the ceaseless, infinite movement of fortuna, requires constant intervention, it's a truth that isn't given, but must be made in reality. And Machiavelli, so it's not so much that Machiavelli is even dismissing the idea of the imagination. I don't think it's about, the importance of this passage isn't the opposition between the truth and the imaginary. The opposition that's important here is internal to the truth itself, two conceptions of truth. One, which is that the truth remains to be made, to be produced, to be realized, brought about, and another which sees the truth as a kind of inert thing that you find, like a property, and then you possess. And Machiavelli is asking us to think about our notion of the truth in such a way that we will opt for the truth that will preserve us, preserve the relationship of forces in let's say, a society based on the multitude. And in this way, we'll be able to persist in the face of all the good and the bad, as he says, that time chases before it and brings to us. So the most important thing here, I think, is Machiavelli's break with traditional philosophical notions of the truth. And instead of theory in a certain way, or I don't know if it's instead of theory, but it becomes a question of practice. This is a truth that exists only in practice. And I don't say it's not a theory, but in a certain way it has to be a theoretical practice, to use Althusser's figure, that is a theory and a truth realized only insofar as it is practiced and becomes practical. And in the absence of this practical existence, the truth itself remains imaginary and unable to affect the reality, and therefore useless, to use his term. And the useless truth, to conclude, is the truth that will lead to ruin. And the truth that is, as we could say, borrowing from an earlier chapter, the truth that is armed, like the armed prophet, is the truth that will realize itself in the world and bring about a transformation.